All right, so I just finished listening to a podcast from this woman who goes by Unbiased Jordan as her podcast name. And at the end, she did a critical thinking sort of question to get people to challenge their views. And one interesting, what she was asking people to challenge their views on specifically had to do with the new guidelines that are being recommended to the CDC to then go ahead and make the recommendation official as to whether to give the hepatitis B vaccine to children at birth, meaning at newborn stage, or to give the hepatitis B vaccine later, like 2 months later or 3 months later. And the idea is that if the parent tests positive or his status is unknown, meaning they can't find the test, they just decide not to get tested or whatever. I don't know how they would determine it as unknown status, but if they test definitively positive, give the Hep B vaccine at birth, at newborn phase, right? If they test negative, then the idea is it goes between the doctor and the parent, and then they can, decide whether to give the hepatitis B vaccine then or delay it, right? And so she asked questions at the end, critical thinking. Okay, if you're for the decision, then the question is, if the child still gets hepatitis B from another family member, should that responsibility fall on the parent, the doctor, or the federal government? And I was thinking about that. And I think that doctors should have the knowledge and should be equipped, right, to understand specifically the risks. The parent should also know, right? Do they have anybody in their inner circle that has hepatitis B? I mean, hepatitis B, if a young baby gets hepatitis B, contracts it, it can lead to a lot of chronic health problems down the line. And that's something that should be avoided, right? So, and then also the other question about the federal government. Well, if the federal government's giving bad guidelines, then that's also problematic. Now, then she asked people who are opposed or in opposition to the decision. First, she asked about Denmark. Denmark actually did a study, and she mentions this. Denmark did a study specifically that basically found, because the concern about why, right, they want to delay the hepatitis B vaccine is over concerns that specific contents in the vaccine, which are meant to increase the immune response. There is a concern about neurodevelopmental disorders being developed from the aluminum compound that's in the vaccine specifically. And then that can cause different levels of chronic disease. That's kind of what the Make America Healthy Again movement sort of is claiming to try to fix, is this whole neurodevelopmental issues. RFK Jr., though he promised to fix chronic disease issues, unfortunately has not necessarily really been that effective in sort of his initial mission and what he promised, because he is focusing a lot on vaccines when there's other elements that should be considered, that should be focused on, right? If you're worried about like autism, right? Or if you're worried about ADHD and you're focusing so myopically on vaccines, but then you're like, okay, great. So we stop giving too many vaccines at once, right? To Gen Alpha, all right? But then we're going to shove iPads in front of now Gen Beta, because they're going to be the ones that are born after 2025. Well, actually, they're already being born right now, but they're the current generation being born is what I'm trying to emphasize. Oh, so, all right, let's change the vaccine schedule, but iPad kids, just shove out the iPads in their face. I feel like that's going to be more detrimental than vaccines, especially considering that so anyway, backtracking to where I was going to when it comes to the Denmark. And if Denmark is the one that did this study. So that's where I'm kind of, coming full circle to. Denmark did a study that found, right, that the aluminum content in the vaccines, there was no causal link that they could find that causes no causal link for the neurodevelopmental disorders in the aluminum. Yet, and this is where she asked people to think critically and if they were opposed to the decision, right? And this was interesting to think about. In that light, Denmark does delay vaccines a little bit more than the US. So if Denmark, that has a robust medical system, much more effective than the US, is recommending delayed vaccination schedules, why can't the US do the same? That was definitely a very interesting situation. And so that's what brings me back to ask, do the benefits outweigh the risk? See, the United States is a much bigger country and might have higher risk of hepatitis B transmission. So that's something that's interesting and worthy of researching. Now, I haven't done the research on Denmark versus US in terms of risk of hepatitis B. And also, we're talking about a bunch of different vaccines too. Denmark is just known to have a different vaccine approach than the United States, apparently. So why does Denmark have a different approach? Different part of the world, different population size, density, and different land size, different economic system. So of course, and also different geopolitical position in the world. So these are all things that might influence the decision to have a different vaccine kind of schedule. She also asked, what about the paternalist, if you're, mandating vaccines right at birth in order for public health measures, is that too paternalistic? My big concern with that is that the situation involving that, when you talk about paternalism, like are the government being like parents? The problem is that the government already upholds a system that allows the wealthiest individuals to lobby for laws that impact how ordinary Americans, regular working class Americans, live their lives. And furthermore, the government exists through a monopoly on force to protect the capital interests. So the whole concern about paternalism is frustrating to see, this sort of like concern about paternalism when it comes to public health measures, and completely ignoring the fact that the government has had a long history of already exercising a monopoly on force in ways that are much more detrimental to human life, and that public health measures are simply an effort to, keep problems from arising that could be very detrimental to human life. However, sometimes medical experts, and this is where, yes, it's important, to challenge your beliefs, because medical experts can sometimes run amok. And sometimes, take for the COVID vaccine, for example, who was affected the most? Young, healthy males were, I do not believe, needed the COVID vaccine. And there's a lot of people who were saying the same thing as me, saying that, look, if you're 18 to 35 and you're a male and you're getting myocarditis, people around you who need it should vaccinate for a COVID vaccine, for COVID-19, right? But maybe not necessarily people in my age group, for example. And so it's important to think critically. It's important to look forward and see, okay, what perhaps is this detrimental or is it not? And so I would say that when it comes to public health measures, one should take things case by case, right? But this overemphasis on public health measures being too paternalistic is a little frustrating. So that's my response to that. But overall, I would say that it might be worth doing more studies on maybe investigating this aluminum compound, since aluminum is, it is a metal that should not be injected into the body too much. However, if there is currently no causal link established between aluminum and neurodevelopmental disorders, then I would say let's not panic. However, if there's concerns about it, especially considering that there are doctors that have raised concerns, yes, do studies about it, but do not let it become a point of sensationalization. And that's my whole thesis when it comes to public health, is you cannot let bias from either side of this whole public health debate sensationalize. You shouldn't get too deep into conspiracy theories. Nevertheless, you should also do your own research. Just because a public health official said something does not mean it may necessarily be true later on. Take cigarettes, for example. Doctors said it was okay to do so. Now, obviously, that's not the case. So, think critically, take everything with a grain of salt. Personally, I believe that it is probably out of an abundance of caution, a good thing to get the hepatitis B vaccine at birth, but there might be concerns. And if Denmark does have a different vaccine schedule, might be worth asking why they do. And then finally, the final question was about, do you protect the collective interests of everybody in a group when it comes to vaccination, or just people who are the most effective? What's more important? And my question is that can be answered by, do the benefits outweigh the risks? If there seriously is a risk being really a genuine, serious risk, then totally, you probably should focus more on those who are most at risk. In the case of the COVID vaccine, that was exactly what it was. Who's most at risk. Yet at the same time, the effects of the COVID vaccine were definitely overblown by conspiracy theorists. So, like I said, leaning too deep into sensationalism when it comes to public health is exactly what leads people into this mass psychosis that gets them very frustrated and is just something that needs to be avoided. So I genuinely do hope that going forward, regardless of how the new guidelines are going to be, that doctors and parents make informed decisions. Doctors are proficient in their knowledge that they learned in med school, and parents understand who is around them and who might be transmitting things. So that's my sort of reaction to that sort of critical thought segment of the Unbiased Jordan podcast, and I recommend you check it out. I want you to hit subscribe, of course, to my channel, and you all have a blessed day.